Hey there, history buffs! Welcome to It Really Happened, where we dive into the wildest and most unbelievable moments in history. Today, we're venturing to the 1800s Midwest for a conflict that almost sounds too strange to be true. The Honey War. Two states, Missouri and Iowa, ready to clash over a disputed border, and a few beehives. Get ready for a wild ride through an odd yet fascinating piece of history that proves even the sweetest things can cause a stir. Think about this. You wake up one morning to find that your backyard, where you've lived for years, suddenly belongs to another state. Wow, sounds crazy, right? Well, for the folks living along the Missouri-Iowa border, this wasn't just a wild dream. It was their daily reality. Let's turn back the clock to 1839 when Missouri and Iowa found themselves in a heated dispute over a strip of land. This wasn't just any patch of dirt. We're talking about a 9 to 13 mile wide area known as the Hairy Nation. So, why on earth would they call it that? Well, it turns out the locals had a reputation for being a bit rough around the edges, with their unkempt appearance and rowdy, independent nature. This disputed area wasn't just valuable because of its size. The Hairy Nation was a treasure trove of natural resources, and at the top of that list were trees. These weren't your average trees. They were the home for countless bees, producing liquid gold in the form of honey and beeswax. Now, you might be saying to yourself, "Come on, it's just honey." But in frontier America, honey and beeswax were big business. These products were crucial for trade and everyday life. Honey wasn't just a sweet treat. It was a staple food and a natural preservative. And beeswax was used for everything from candles to waterproofing. So when we're talking about bee trees, we're talking about people's livelihoods. But the bee trees weren't the only thing causing a buzz in the Hairy Nation. The political climate of the time was as sticky as the honey itself. You see, most of the folks living in this disputed area had come from free states, and they weren't too keen on the idea of being governed by Missouri, a slave state. The thought of paying taxes to Missouri left a bitter taste in their mouths. As if the situation wasn't tense enough, along came the incident that would spark the conflict and give this dispute its sweet name. 3 bee trees, standing tall and proud, are suddenly cut down by an unknown culprit. It might not sound like much to us today, but back then, this was seen as an act of aggression. It was like someone had declared a war on the very livelihood of the Hairy Nation's residents. The fall of these 3 trees was the final straw. Tensions that had been simmering for years suddenly boiled over. The residents of Iowa were buzzing with anger, seeing this as a direct attack on their way of life. Meanwhile, Missouri stood its ground, insisting that the land and its valuable bee trees belonged to them. As tensions reached a boiling point, 2 unlikely characters stepped onto the stage: Governor Robert Lucas of Iowa and Governor Lilburn Boggs of Missouri. These men couldn't have been more different, yet they shared one trait that would push this conflict to the brink: stubborn determination. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? The Honey War was about to find out. Governor Robert Lucas of Iowa was a man of many hats. He had served as a lieutenant colonel in the War of 1812 and was a trained surveyor. Lucas had a reputation for being a strong, sometimes even warlike leader. On the other side of the border, we had Governor Lilburn W. Boggs of Missouri, known for his unyielding nature and refusal to back down from a fight. The clash between these 2 governors turned what was already a tense situation into a powder keg ready to explode. It all started when Missouri officials began assessing property for taxes in the disputed area. Now, you can imagine how well that went over with the folks living there. These people, many of whom had come from free states, weren't exactly thrilled at the idea of being taxed by a slave state like Missouri. Governor Lucas wasn't about to take this lying down. In July 1839, he issued a proclamation that might as well have been a declaration of war. He asserted that Iowa laws must be upheld against any encroachment from Missouri officials. But he didn't stop there. Lucas went so far as to threaten arrest for any Missouri official who dared to enter the area north of the Sullivan Line. Not to be outdone, Governor Boggs fired back with his own proclamation on August 23, 1839. He insisted on Missouri's right to enforce its jurisdiction over the claimed land. However, in a slight nod to diplomacy or perhaps self-preservation, Boggs advised his officials not to provoke Iowa. As the war of words escalated, so did the fears of actual conflict. Governor Lucas, in a speech to the Iowa Legislative Assembly, expressed his belief that the dispute would ultimately lead to the effusion of blood. Now, that's not exactly the kind of thing you want to hear from your state's leader, is it? The situation was becoming more absurd by the day. Here were two states, part of the same country, ready to come to blows over a strip of land filled with bee trees. The residents of a hairy nation found themselves caught in the middle of this political tug-of-war. With neither governor willing to back down, the conflict seemed destined for a violent conclusion. Both Lucas and Boggs began to call up militia forces, preparing their states for the possibility of armed conflict. With militia forces gathering on both sides of the border, tensions were at an all-time high. As the governors of Missouri and Iowa stubbornly stood their ground, their respective militias began to assemble. 2,200 farmers, many of whom had never held a gun before, suddenly found themselves thrust into the role of soldiers. These weren't trained troops. These were everyday people, farmers, shopkeepers, and laborers, who suddenly found themselves caught up in a border dispute over honey trees. Now, you might think that preparing for potential armed conflict would be a serious affair, and in some ways it was. But the reality on the ground was far from the disciplined military operation you might imagine. These hastily assembled troops were woefully unprepared for actual combat. Many showed up without proper supplies, some without even basic necessities like food or blankets. It was as if they thought they were going on a weekend camping trip rather than marching to war. But what they lacked in supplies and training, they made up for in, well, let's call it spirit. And by spirit, I mean 5 wagons of whiskey. Many of the militia members seemed to believe that liquid courage was just as important as their ammunition. As one eyewitness put it, the captain was determined to keep up the spirits of the men. The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on the militia members themselves. As they gathered on either side of the disputed border, a sense of disbelief and amusement began to set in. The Missouri militia in particular seemed to embrace the ridiculousness of it all. When they learned that their services were no longer needed, they decided to conduct a mock military funeral for a deer. Yes, you heard that right. They split the poor creature down the middle and named each half after their respective governors, Lucas and Boggs. It was a moment of dark humor that perfectly captured the absurd nature of the entire conflict. As the days wore on and the two makeshift armies faced each other across the border, tension mixed with a growing sense of futility. These men, many of whom had farms to tend and families to feed, found themselves caught up in a conflict that seemed increasingly pointless. The initial bravado and excitement gave way to boredom and frustration. They'd come expecting a war, but instead found themselves in a bizarre standoff where the greatest danger seemed to be dying of boredom, or possibly alcohol poisoning. Just when it seemed the honey war would fizzle out in a haze of whiskey and boredom, the fate of the two states hung in the balance, as negotiators prepared to wage peace most unexpectedly. A group of level-headed men accomplished what two governors and their makeshift armies couldn't. They were the unsung heroes of the honey war. On December 12, 1839, these brave souls ventured into the Clark County Courthouse in Missouri with a mission to stop a war with words, not weapons. On one side, you've got the Iowa delegation, led by the charismatic Colonel Patterson. On the other, the Missouri officials, likely eyeing these Iowans with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. As the negotiations began, the air crackled with anticipation. Would these talks lead to peace, or would they be the spark that ignited a full-blown conflict? Colonel Patterson, a man with a military background and a knack for diplomacy, took center stage. His goal was clear: convince both governors to call off their militias and let the federal government settle this mess. Their stakes were sky high. One wrong word, one misunderstanding, and the delicate peace could shatter. Families could be torn apart, farms destroyed, and lives lost, all over some honey-filled trees and a strip of land. As the talks progressed, the hostility that had been building for months began to melt away. Both sides expressed a desire for friendship and positive dealings. It was as if everyone in that courtroom suddenly remembered they were neighbors, not enemies. Colonel Patterson and his team, which included Lawson B. Hughes and Dr. Jesse D. Payne, presented Iowa's position with skill and tact. They didn't come to point fingers or make demands. Instead, they came up with a simple yet powerful proposal. Let's step back, cool off, and let the federal government sort this out. The tension in the room was palpable as the Missouri officials considered this proposal. Would they see it as a sign of weakness, or would they recognize it as the olive branch it was meant to be? In a moment that would go down in history, the Clark County Court agreed to recall the Missouri Militia. And just like that, the immediate threat of conflict disappeared. The honey war, it seemed, would end not with a bang, but with a handshake. So what was the final verdict in this sweet and sticky conflict? In 1849, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of Iowa, establishing the border at the Sullivan Line. Missouri had to give up its claim to the disputed territory, and just like that, the honey war came to an end. As we wrap up this sticky tale, it's clear the honey war wasn't just about honey or borders. It was a perfect example of how human stubbornness and miscommunication can turn small disputes into big problems. But it also shows us something important: the power of talking things out. When cooler heads stepped in, they managed to stop a war with words instead of weapons. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many conflicts today could be solved if we just sat down and listened to each other? So next time you hear conflicts that spiral out of control, think back to the honey war. So what do you think? Could a little more talking and a little less fighting solve some of our current problems? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed learning about this unusual border conflict, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell for more amazing true accounts in history. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep exploring history's hidden gems.